Record wars with a camera and reminisce about history with a lens. With various identities, Wei Ran returned to the battlefield of World War II and even the Cold War era time and time again. His camera also recorded unknown heroes and treasures submerged in the war. The bloody World War II, the Cold War era shrouded in nuclear shadows, countless secrets buried by time, and forever sealed in the film with his shutter. Keywords of the novel. War Photographer's Letters without pop-ups. Download the complete collection of War Photographer's Letters TXT, and read the latest chapters of War Photographer's Letters. Chapter 1. The Gift of Professor Cute. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. The Gift of Professor Cute. Due south of Volgograd, the town of Cha-Cha on the banks of Lake Cha-Cha once again welcomes the farm market every Tuesday. In an abandoned farm next to the lakeside, cars or vans that covered their license plates were arranged neatly according to customary rules, and the open trunk was filled with various strange objects. From the World War II medal remaining in the mud, to the Makarov pistol emitting a gun oil smell. From various inexplicable porcelain vases, to outdated accordions and record players. There are even passports, suitcases, and laptops stolen from unknown countries. Basically, as long as you are willing to spend money, you can always find some strange things here. In the core area of the market, a Slavic old man in his 50s, with a strong alcohol smell, was carrying half a bottle of gin in one hand and half a pickled cucumber in the other, stopping between stalls and occasionally calling for the vendor to whisper a few questions in his ear. And behind him, there was also an Asian young man pulling a shopping cart. There's nothing else in this tattered shopping cart, all kinds of Soviet World War II-era newspapers and magazines. Even at the very edge, there was an unopened bottle of gin and half a can of pickled cucumbers. Professor, we've been wandering all morning. Are you sure you can really find a clue in this haunted place? Wei Ran pulled apart a woman who had taken the initiative to promote reading materials and asked the old man who had just finished chatting with the vendor in a bored manner. Victor, you need some patience. Professor Alexei took a leisurely sip of wine and said, if you feel bored, you can go around by yourself or go fishing by the lake. But rest assured, we will definitely find what you want. 2 hours ago, you said the same thing. Wei Ran reluctantly twisted open the jar and let the other person pinch out a sour cucumber again. You haven't found what you're looking for, but half of the sour cucumber has already been consumed. Also, don't forget that my teacher asked me to keep an eye on you and drink less alcohol. He said, when I finish drinking this bottle of wine, if I haven't found it yet, I'll go back and give you an extra graduation gift. How about that? Alexei shook the bottle and said, as a thank you, forget about drinking. In the afternoon, I'll take you to play on Lake Cha-Cha when I have time. Actually, buying information is fake. Is it true to find a chance to drink? Wei Ran exposed the other party's trick without any expectations. Also, let me guess, this time's gift is a bunch of brand new Soviet rubles. Fuck Stalin. Professor Alexei jumped and cursed, I've already given away all my Soviet rubles. Is there only one last stack left? Wei Ran asked in anticipation. Fart. Fart your Stalin. Professor Alexei pointed around with a red face, I'll pick you a decent gift at this market this time, worth at least 5,000 rubles. As long as I don't have to pay for it myself, said Wei Ran, blocking all the old man's escape routes. I'm so blind. How could I have left you, this bastard, in a moment of confusion? Alexei looked up and took a sip of gin, too lazy to say another word to Wei Ran, and walked unsteadily towards the next stall. And Wei Ran, who followed him like a carefree person, continued to push the shopping cart and focused on becoming a porter. The quarrel between him and Professor Alexei began almost 4 years ago when he first came here to study. He had hoped that after graduating from university, he could finally rest his ears and lips, but he didn't expect this old man to keep himself with his good job as a professor's assistant. But the reason for such good treatment is all due to Professor Alexei having a Chinese wife, and more importantly, to this teacher and Wei Ran's mother, who were classmates from kindergarten to high school. Otherwise, my dismal college entrance examination results would definitely not qualify me to enter the Volgograd National University as an international student to study history. Even if it weren't for the hands-on teaching and word-by-word practice of Professor Alexei and his teacher in these 4 or 5 years, let alone the graduation certificate, I'm afraid I wouldn't even understand this nonsense. Of course, for Professor Alexei, who drinks 5 different things every day, he just wants a trustworthy cheap labor force to help him do some private work. Following Professor Alexei along the way, when half of the bottle of gin and pickled cucumbers were all in Professor Alexei's stomach, the two finally found the person they were looking for in a remote small stall. After rounds of bargaining, Alexei reluctantly offered a high price of 50,000 rubles, and it was only then that Wei Ran was able to smoothly lift the wooden suitcase into the shopping cart. According to the vendor, all the negatives in this box were taken during World War II, but whether they could find the clues they were looking for from these films remains a question mark. How about giving me this broken box? Alexei held on to the 50,000 rubles and asked with his chin, pointing to the completely rusted tin box at the corner of the stall. Unless you add 8,000 rubles, the vendor said, gripping the other side of the ruble. Are you crazy about poverty? Professor Alexei raised his voice at least 8 times, selling a broken box for 8,000 rubles. Why don't you go rob the Petersburg Bank? It's just like the negatives you bought, all from the same closed photo studio. The vendor released the ruble and kicked the box at the edge of the booth with his toes. And since I got it, I haven't even had time to open it yet. Maybe there's gold inside. Gold. Why didn't you say there was Stalin sucking on a pipe inside? Professor Alexei shook the banknote in his hand and said, I'll give you at most 3,000 rubles. This broken box will only deceive foreign tourists. Who among the locals would buy this kind of garbage? Deal. The vendor decisively agreed to this transaction, and the box was not bought at all, but rather a gift he demanded from the buyer like Professor Alexei at the time. As for whether the box really had any treasures, the vendor had no doubt. He had already used an engine endoscope to examine the rusted and damaged parts, and there were only some clothes inside that had already gone moldy, otherwise he would have opened them long ago. Since the box was bought by me, how about giving me this vernier caliper? Professor Alexei, who was taking advantage of the situation, bent down and picked up an open electric wooden box. Otherwise, I'll give you my wife as well. The vendor angrily snatched back the vernier caliper and said, this is a high-end product produced by Bosch in Germany during World War II. It's even more expensive than the torn film you bought. If you don't give it, then don't give it. Alexei reached out and picked up a bayonet from World War II Germany. Can you give this to me? Old thing, are you buying it or not? The vendor lifted the hem of his clothes and revealed a polished P38 pistol. No, I didn't say I wouldn't buy it. Professor Alexei decisively put the bayonet back in place, took out several large bills from his wallet, and handed them to the other party along with the ruble that had been held in his hand. Greeting Wei Ran, who pretended not to know him from afar, the almost rotten iron box was loaded into the shopping cart. The two of them immediately walked towards the parking lot of the dock market. Professor, why did you buy this broken box? Wei Ran asked while picking out a rusty shell the size of a bottle cap from the tin box. Take a closer look at what's written on the side of that box, Professor Alexei proudly reminded. Wei Ran bent down to take a look and said, Truth. Truth newspaper. It's the Truth Daily. The owner of this box may be a journalist from that newspaper, and there might be a camera that the journalist used inside. After trying to pick up the second bottle of gin from the shopping cart without any results, Professor Alexei shamelessly said, but no matter what treasures are in this box, they are all yours. Consider them your college graduation gift. Are you teasing me? Wei Ran said with a ghostly expression, who would want this damn thing? Victor, dear Victor, Professor Alexei said seriously, compared to the value of the unknown treasure in the box itself, the surprise when opening the box is the most precious, isn't it? No, you're just not willing to spend money. Wei Ran mercilessly exposed this stingy professor's almost useless trick once again. Stop talking nonsense, do you want it? Alex abruptly switched to authentic Chinese and asked, with a tone that resembled the posture of his aunt when she got angry. Yes, why don't you come for nothing? Wei Ran stubbornly said, if I had known earlier, it would have been better to get another stack of Soviet rubles from the other party. At least those useless papers that don't make the windows transparent would have been willing to be bought by idiots even if they were priced at 50 yuan per piece. But this almost rusted tin box, whether its owner is a journalist or not, even if it is a journalist, there is a question mark about whether there is an old camera inside. Leaving the market, Professor Alexei never mentioned going boating at Lake Cha-Cha and urged Wei Ran to drive the dirty Waltz van towards the direction of Volgograd city. I didn't mind the fact that I already knew this would happen, so I drove straight to the urban area located on the west bank of the Volga River, more than 60 kilometers away. When Wei Ran stopped his car at the foot of a high-end apartment building, Professor Alexei pointed to the back carriage before getting off. Remember to check all those negatives when you go back, he said before Wei Ran could open his mouth. Professor Alexei, who had just left the carriage, patted his head and said, also, if you find any clues related to tanks or World War II in the photos, remember to message me. There's one more thing. Professor Alexei, who had just taken a few steps, ran back and then saw Wei Ran holding a bottle of gin, smiling and waiting for him. It's okay now. Professor Alexei took the gin with satisfaction and walked into the apartment door. 10, 9, 8 sat in the driver's cab, but Wei Ran was not in a hurry to leave. Instead, he slowly began counting down. As expected, before he could count down to 0, Professor Alexei, holding a bottle of wine, ran out of the apartment building in a hurry. Why haven't you left yet? Professor Alexei asked as he opened the carriage door. You must have forgotten to take something again, Wei Ran responded with a long-guessed expression. Why don't you know how to help me deliver it? Professor Alexei picked up a bouquet of roses he had bought at the pier market, and without waiting for a response from the combustion engine, he turned around and walked into the apartment. It's almost time this time, Wei Ran said before restarting the car and heading straight to a Soviet-era workshop used for processing canned fish, located between the statue of his mother and the Volga River. This old workshop, which is 50 meters long and nearly 15 meters wide, was purchased by Professor Alexei and his wife at the end of last year for a high-price loan. Most of the area was converted by the teacher into a special homestay and travel agency, while the other half was converted into Professor Alexei's private work studio. As for Wei Ran, he usually doesn't work for Professor Alexei in the studio, or he visits the neighboring travel agency as a tour guide for a few days, taking domestic tourists to eat, drink, and have fun while also talking about Soviet history learned in college. Although these days have been fulfilling, the benefits are not low. At least this year's tuition fees have come back. And most importantly, living here is much more comfortable than the worn-out dormitories crawling with bugs at national universities. The familiar person parked the dirty What's bread at the entrance of the studio, and Wei Ran took out the key to open the rolling shutter door. Then, he moved the negative of the wooden box he bought a few hours ago onto the workbench. At the innermost corner of this massive work, at least a quarter of the space is filled with rows of bookshelves, all of which are preserved by various historical archives, old film negatives, and even videotapes accumulated by Professor Alexei over the years. As for the clients of this studio, there are various public or private museums, as well as excavators wandering in the wilderness digging for war treasures, and of course, there are also some people sent by underground auctions. Just like the T.34 tank that temporarily occupied the entrance of this studio, it was recently dug up by a local collector from their backyard. Of course, no one really cares if it was dug out of their own backyard, and the reason it was sent to this studio is simply because the collector hopes that Professor Alexei can find out the combat history of this T.34 tank so that he can tell a good story or sell it for a good price. Just like all the T.34 tanks produced from the tractor factory in this city during the Battle of Stalingrad, its body was never painted or numbered. But there are 5 remaining red paint fingerprints on the left side of its turret. This is also Professor Alexei's only clue, but unfortunately, apart from being able to confirm that it was produced by Stalingrad tractor factory, they have not found any clues about this tank in the past 2 weeks. If it weren't for Professor Alexei always having a way to resell the purchased materials, the 500,000 rubles provided by the collector for the event would probably have been spent. I hope these negatives can provide some valuable clues, right? After rubbing his hands and opening the wooden box, Wei Ran took out a book of negative photos and placed it on the table. Each of these film albums is A4 paper size, 5 or 6 centimeters thick, and even on the first page of each album, the shooting time and film specifications of these films are neatly marked with a pen. Even next to each film, the location of the shooting and the name of the person or object are written in the same handwriting. Such meticulous work doesn't look like a rough hand. Wei Ran made a self-deprecating joke and then found the photo album taken in 1941. Starting from the first page, he took out the cut film and stuck it on the copy board. Turn on the power and press the switch. Wei Ran picked up a magnifying glass that was large enough for the mouth of a bowl and carefully observed the content captured on each film. The moments captured in these films over half a century ago seemed to carry a lingering smell of gunpowder, from the ruins of dilapidated buildings to the streets littered with corpses, to the smoking suburban battlefields and muddy trenches, and even the wounded and busy nurses lying in the field hospitals. The content recorded in each film is particularly heart-wrenching. Looking at the negatives one by one, as expected, no footage related to the T.34 tank was found. Still unsatisfied, he put these precious negatives back in their original positions and flipped to the second page to continue the previous operation. Quickly, the entire film album was flipped to the last page, and Wei Ran rubbed his eyes that had been shaken. After taking a break, he took out the 1942 film album. In this tedious repetition, the negatives ran past Wei Ran like a lantern. Occasionally, there was a lens of the T.34 tank in the photo, so I quickly took it off and fixed it on the clip. I used a scanner to scan it into the computer for coloring, which was much more convenient than directly washing it into a photo. I have been busy living until it gets dark. Even the statue of my mother outside the window has been illuminated by lights for over an hour, and even the content in the film has turned into various life and scenery photos after retirement. But there are less than 50 negatives that are eligible to be scanned into the computer, and he can even confirm that these scanned photos are likely not related to the tank behind him. Bang dang, Wei ran through the heavy magnifying glass onto the table, kneading his sore neck while muttering to himself, another 50,000 rubles. I hope the professor can sell these negatives for a good price. Don't worry, I can sell these negatives tomorrow. Professor Alexei almost stumbled into the studio and brought a sumptuous dinner to Wei Ran. Scared me, when did you come? Wei Ran quickly released the Tupolev pistol from the drawer, which Professor Alexei had personally put in, so that if one day a thief came in, he wouldn't even have the strength to fight back. Just arrived, come over and have dinner quickly. Professor Alexei's lies come straight out of his mouth. He wouldn't admit that he came over 2 hours ago, but he quietly hid at the neighboring travel agency to have coffee with his wife while watching Wei Ran busy. Where's my aunt? Wei Ran was too lazy to wash his hands. After opening the lunch box, he began to wolf down the steaming braised pork belly. I was back an hour ago, Professor Alexei said before realizing that he had slipped his tongue. Without saying a word, he unplugged the power, picked up his laptop, and quickly ran out of the studio. This old bastard. Wei Ran, who was almost choked to death, forcefully hammered his chest and watched as Professor Alexei drove his BMW sedan away at the end of the street. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Legacies of War Journalists. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Legacies of War Journalists. After picking up the food in the lunchbox in pairs, Wei Ran looked at the electronic watch on the wall. It was already almost 9 p.m., so he packed up the negatives and put them back in the wooden box. He closed the rolling shutter door and prepared to go up to the second floor to rest. But when he saw the What's Bread parked at the door, he suddenly remembered the mischievous gift the professor gave him and his speculation about the identity of the box and the owners of these negatives. Maybe there could be some clues in that box. After hesitating for a moment, Wei Ran opened the rolling shutter door again and carried the rusty iron box from the trunk of the van into the studio. This box is the size of a microwave, and on one side, there is still a faint inscription of Truth Report. But the lid of the box had completely rusted away from the surroundings, even the padlock the size of a bottle cap was covered in green rust. Such a tattered gift, even if it was given by the professor, Wei Ran couldn't muster the thought of cherishing it. He immediately brought a hammer and screwdriver and began to violently dismantle it. First, use a hammer to smash off the padlock, and then pry along the gap between the lid and the box. It didn't take much effort, and the almost rusted iron box was easily opened. "There's quite a lot of things," Wei Ran murmured, carefully putting on his gloves, and carefully starting to take things out of this box. He is not worried about damaging the items in the box, he is simply afraid of being cut and infected with tetanus by the rusty box. The first ones to be taken out were several suits and ties that already had a strong musty smell, as well as 2 pairs of alkali-resistant old leather shoes. These things have no value at all, and were directly carried by Wei Ran and thrown into the garbage bin next to the wall. Continuing to scroll down, this time I took out a set of Soviet military uniforms from World War II, but this set of military uniforms wrapped in Soviet military cloaks did not have any military rank badges or similar items. At least this military uniform is a complete set. Perhaps Professor Alexei has a way to help sell it, so he decided to put it aside and continue to take things out of the box. The expected antique camera simply didn't exist, and after taking out several classic books wrapped in newspapers from the box one after another, the only thing left in the box was an old-fashioned cowhide briefcase carefully wrapped in a woolen coat. After flipping through the pockets of the woolen coat to make sure there was nothing, Wei Ran finally opened the slightly moldy black briefcase. I won. As soon as Wei Ran opened the zipper, his eyes lit up and he reached out to take out a small pistol contained in a cowhide holster from his bag. Skillfully opening the holster and taking out the pistol, Wei Ran recognized the model of this pistol at a glance. It was a PPK pistol produced during World War II in Germany. But this pistol, which was solidified with thick gun oil, was far more exquisite than the one seen by Wei Ran. Not only was there a clear brittle eagle emblem steel seal on the barrel, but even on both sides of the red wooden grip, the Soviet emblem and the sickle hammer that had long been abandoned by this country were carved. Carefully removing the empty magazine, the firearm pulled the sleeve, and there were not a single bullet in the barrel, even completely filled with dried butter. Subconsciously looking back at the locked roller shutter door, Wei Ran breathed a sigh of relief. This small pistol should not be seen by the professor, otherwise he would definitely confiscate it. After all, in Russia, although AK-47s can be easily purchased, handguns are particularly tightly controlled. Once he is discovered by the police as an international student with a handgun, sending him back to his country is probably the lightest outcome. I also have a gun now. Excitedly, Wei Ran held up his small pistol and glanced around. After getting tired of it, he reinserted the pistol and 2 empty magazines back into his holster and put them into his pants pocket. Continuing to flip through the black briefcase, all that remained was a brown leather notebook wrapped in old newspapers and a red plastic identification document. Pravda reporter. Boris Nikolaevich Bolvoy. Naruto looked at the press card in his hand, feeling that the name of the deceased elder seemed particularly familiar. Whoa. Sleeping trough. Wei Ran looked at the character introduction found on his phone screen and finally remembered who this person was after exclaiming in surprise. During the Soviet Patriotic War, this Polev participated in many battles, including the Battle of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad, as a journalist accompanying the Truth Daily. He even followed the Soviet army into Berlin in 1945 and even reported the entire process of the Nuremberg trials after the war ended. These legendary experiences may not be clear to most Chinese people, but great works such as Traveling 30,000 Miles in China and The True Man, Footless Pilot are definitely well known in China, and their authors are all war journalists who have received the Order of Lenin and the Gold Medal, and even promoted to colonel after the war. Turning to his senses, Wei Ran threw his phone directly onto the table, and saw Yazzie rush to the trash can by the wall, carefully picking up the clothes and shoes he had just discarded. If these clothes belong to that legendary journalist, they can definitely sell for a high price and even qualify for being sent to a museum. I carefully checked the clothes taken out of the trash can and luckily they didn't get any stains. After settling down, Wei Ran breathed a sigh of relief and then picked up the cowhide notebook that he had just thrown aside. This cowhide notebook is the same as those negative photo albums just now, all the size of A4 paper, 5 or 6 centimeters thick, but the integrated cowhide back cover is about 10 centimeters longer than the cover. When it is closed, it happens to be placed on the cover to protect the book opening. However, after he untied the cowhide rope, a silver-white feather-shaped bookmark is still fixed on the outer cover of the wide back cover. Weighing the weight of this bookmark, the heavy feel proves that it is definitely some kind of precious metal. Putting it aside with great care, Wei Ran's attitude improved a lot and he carefully opened the slightly moldy cover. A faint musty smell rushed over my face, and on the first page of this notebook, there was a photo of a man wearing a Soviet military uniform during World War II. But beneath this business card-sized photo, there is a completely unfamiliar name written in 2 clear lines of pen letters. War photographer Alexander Alkatayevich Trotsky. Who is this person again? Wei Ran picked up his phone again, but after a search, there was no clue about the name at all. With confusion, I picked up the cowhide notebook again and flipped it to the second page, which was also adorned with a black and white photo the size of a cigarette box. The protagonist in the photo was actually a Ural motorcycle, and next to the photo, there was also a palm-sized paper bag with several glued negatives inside. In the rest of this page, neat Russian handwriting is used to record something, but unfortunately, this cowhide notebook seems to have been invaded by moisture, and most of these handwriting has become blurry. Patiently flipping to the third page, there was still a black and white photo with a paper bag filled with negatives and a page full of blurry text, but the protagonist in the photo turned into a GAZ sedan. Continuing to scroll down, the protagonist in the photo on page 4 has been replaced with a Mosingan rifle. At the same time, the text on this page is particularly clear and concise, with only one sentence. I killed people who shouldn't have been killed, but war left me with no choice. A serious photographer who wrote a special diary. Wei Ran muttered to himself, flipping his notes to page 5. In the photo on this page, it turns out to be a Li-2 aircraft, and the surrounding handwriting is once again blurry. Wei Ran raised his eyebrows. This is only 5 pages, from motorcycles to cars, and then to rifles. In the end, he even took pictures of airplanes. Is the photographer named Deathly Elder specialized in shooting war equipment? Curious, Wei Ran continued to flip through, but in the black and white photo on page 6, there was only a broken watch, and no letters were even written on the pale yellow paper. Continuing to flip back, starting from page 7 and continuing until the end, this notebook surprisingly remained blank. Gently closed the notebook and put the bookmark back in its original position. After thinking for a moment, Wei Ran took out his phone and dialed Professor Alexei's phone again. Who are you talking about? Bolvoy. War correspondent Boris Nikolaevich Bolvoy. After listening to Wei Ran's description, Professor Alexei immediately stepped on the brake and began to turn around. I'm going back now. We've made a fortune this time. Listening to the busy sound on his phone, Wei Ran pursed his lips. He had already decided that after this old man returned, he must calculate his overtime pay carefully before letting him in. Strict statement. The author is not Jingsu, let alone a virtuous stick. If possible, I hope my story doesn't have to leave the lovely 9.6 million square kilometers from beginning to end. The following story is just to commemorate some of the heroic but unknown figures in the anti-French Silk War, to borrow their stories, to borrow their heroes, to commemorate our own heroes. More than, end of this chapter. Chapter 3. Stalingrad Meat Grinder. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Stalingrad Meat Grinder, Clash. Wei Ran, who had just hung up the phone, accidentally glanced at the leather notebook placed on the table and then widened his eyes, even sliding his phone out of his hand and hitting his big toe. Lying in a groove. Hiss. Wei Ran sat on the floor, bared his teeth and kneaded his big feet, only wearing sandals. When he calmed down, he didn't even care about sliding his phone under the table. He jumped and ran to the edge of the writing desk, looking at the leather notebook on the table with his mouth open. Compared to before, this tattered cowhide notebook seemed to be 80 years younger. Not only did the mold all over the body disappear, but even the dark brown cowhide outer skin was smooth and shiny. Even the 4 oversized copper-clad corners were shiny as if they had just been installed. But none of these were enough to make him fall off the phone he only bought last month, but rather the silver-white feather-shaped bookmark floating straight up and down above the notebook, slowly rotating. Are you afraid it's not some Soviet black technology? Wei Ran trembled as he reached out his finger and shook it between the bookmark and the refreshed cowhide notebook, without any hindrance. Even the floating bookmark remained steady without even shaking. Try again at the top of the bookmark. There are no thin lines or anything like that. This is not scientific. Wei Ran shouted nonsense, hesitated for a moment, and then extended his index finger to lightly touch the eerie bookmark. Clash. The metal bookmark landed on the glass countertop with a crisp impact sound, accompanied by Wei Ran's heart pumping. Calm down and gently lift the notebook, making him sweat profusely. The photo on the first page of the notebook has not only turned into color, but even the person in the photo has become his ID photo. At the bottom of the photo, there is a Chinese character with the words, War Photographer Wei Ran, written in flying dragons and phoenixes. On this page, the photos that originally existed are gone, and the characters on them are also gone. Did you hit a ghost? Wei Ran looked behind him in shock, realizing that the rolling shuttered door of the studio was locked. Looking at the top of my head, the pale fluorescent tubes did not flicker like in horror movies. Looking down at the leather notebook on the desk again, Wei Ran was stunned. Where is the notebook? Looking left and right, even the feather-shaped metal bookmark is missing. The humid and hot evening breeze blowing from the Volga River entered the studio through the window, but he couldn't help but shiver. This ghostly place is less than a kilometer away from the top of Mount Mamiev in a straight line, and during World War II, it was a truly flesh and blood mill. How many people have died in this special code? With a gulp, he swallowed his saliva and was about to raise his hand to wipe the cold sweat off his forehead, but an unintentional glance made his heart tremble again. At some point, he already had an unfolded notebook tattoo on his left tiger mouth. On this tattoo that is only the size of a matchbox, there is also a feather pen pattern that seems to be writing something. Wei Ran sat on the chair with a dull gaze, his expression filled with thick fear. What's going on with this tattoo? Where's the notebook? Almost at the moment when he raised this idea, his once empty left hand suddenly sank, and the leather notebook appeared out of thin air again. Startled again, Wei Ran trembled as if holding on to a hot red charcoal and throwing out his notebook. At the same time, he leaned back and slammed the chair heavily onto the floor. With a soft, clattering sound, the notebook that fell on the desktop flipped to the third page as if there was no one around. The feather-shaped metal bookmark also hovered on the page again and began to move rapidly, making a fine sound of brushing and brushing. Struggling to get up, Wei Ran cautiously leaned in, only to see the feather-shaped bookmark quickly drawing a T.3476 tank on the light yellow paper. Clash. The thing called a metal feather pen instead of a bookmark fell back on the glass countertop, making a crisp sound again. Looking at the paper at this moment, directly below the exceptionally precise tank, it was written in neat Chinese characters. Role identity. Victor, a war correspondent for Truth Daily return condition. Assist Lieutenant Lev in completing the task and take 6 photos. A war correspondent. Lieutenant Leviticus. Wei Ran had just finished reading those small words, and his eyes were already shrouded in intense white light. At the same time, there were rumbling gunfire and shouting in his ears. Subconsciously blinking his eyes, his regained gaze left him in a daze. Above his head, a plane emitting thick smoke and snowflakes slowly falling like ashes, surrounded by endless ruins and walls, not far from the street corner, and even a tank emitting thick smoke. However, in the field of vision, there are more corpses and trenches visible everywhere. Some of these corpses were wearing Soviet military uniforms from World War II, while others were wearing German military uniforms from World War II. However, the most common ones were civilians who had no uniform at all. Men, women, elderly people, and even children. Just as he looked around with a frightened expression, a shell flying from somewhere hit the ruins in the distance. A huge shockwave carried bricks and soil, and even an unknown part of his body flew into mid-air. Wei Ran shivered and rolled into the trench beside him like a donkey, but before he could get up, a young soldier in the Soviet uniform of World War II stood against his chest with a submachine gun. "Which unit are you from?" The soldier saw Wei Ran's frightened expression, and his disdain became increasingly apparent. "Me. What did I do?" "Ah, yes." Wei Ran forced himself to calm down and stuttered, "Journalist, a journalist from Pravda." "Journalist." The man's attitude was relatively better. "Where's your press ID?" "Press ID." Wei Ran lowered his head and looked at himself. In the last second, he was still wearing sandals, beach pants, and a T-dot shirt. At this point, he was already wearing a dirty Soviet military uniform, and even had an old-fashioned Lulai dual-reflex camera hanging around his neck. He hurriedly touched his body and finally pulled out a tattered document from his shirt pocket. However, before he could even catch a glimpse of it, he was snatched by Soviet soldiers beside him. "Are you really a journalist?" The soldier returned his identification to Wei Ran and hesitated for a moment before pushing the muzzle of his Paposha submachine gun to one side. He then reached out his hand and said, "Lev, I am Lieutenant Lev from the 644 Independent Tank Battalion. Your name is Victor. Are you Lieutenant Leviticus?" Wei Ran was stunned and quickly replied, "Yes, Victor. My name is Victor. It's an exciting and great name." Lev's face had already shown a happy smile. The name Victor, which means victory in Russian, did have an uplifting effect on the soldiers struggling on the front line. "How could you be here?" Lev asked, leaning against the trench. "I got lost," Wei Ran, who quickly entered the scene, pointed behind him. "I was there when I woke up, I don't know where the others went. Don't look for them anymore. In Stalingrad hell, no one can see the sun the next day." "Where?" "Stalingrad." Wei Ran looked around nervously, then retreated into the trench covered in decaying corpses with a pale expression. Lieutenant Lev bent down and picked up an MP-40 submachine gun from the body of a German soldier. "Take it, it's more useful than the camera in your hand. I hope you'll live until these bullets run out," he said. Wei Ran opened his mouth to say something, but in the end, he trembled and took a bullet from the top of his submachine gun. He has been in Russia for so many years at least, and he often goes to gun shops or hunts with his professor every now and then. I won't say much about his shooting skills, but he definitely knows how to use them. "Is this trench yours?" Wei Ran, who had calmed down, asked without saying a word, actually just trying to indirectly ask Lieutenant Lev what his mission was. Unexpectedly, Lieutenant Lev shook his head and dug out a pack of cigarettes from the jacket pocket of a corpse next to him. He lit the flames on the edge of the trench and silently took a few sips before pointing to the tank still smoking not far away and saying, "We're just passing by here. Where are you going next?" Wei Ran hesitated to speak. If Lieutenant Lev gave up his mission, would he be able to go back on his own? This is the Battle of Stalingrad, which can be called a meat grinder. He doesn't want to adventure in such a haunted place. Lieutenant Lev flicked his cigarette butt and said decisively, of course, to continue completing my mission. Damn it. Can you tell me what the mission is? Maybe I can help you. Wei Ran swallowed his saliva with difficulty. Lieutenant Lev glanced at Wei Ran, straightened his waist slightly, and pointed to his head, saying, the Germans have set up howitzer positions 2 streets away, and the shells flying over our heads are coming from there. If we don't eliminate them, it will be difficult for other troops to recapture Mamiev Hill. Conquering Mamiev Hill. Wei Ran was momentarily taken aback and quickly asked, what date is today? On the 28th, September 28th, what happened? Lieutenant Lev asked inexplicably. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Oleg's home. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Oleg's home. No, it's nothing. Wei Ran quickly waved his hand, so he naturally wouldn't tell Lieutenant Lev that tomorrow in history, which was September 29, 1942, the Soviet Front Army had temporarily recaptured the Mamiev post. Since then, the Soviet and German sides have been occupying this highland alternately, and the war situation has been getting worse day by day. And this time point is even written in his university major textbook. Alright, the shelling is over. You can run in the direction of the Volga River, where there is a large army. If you're lucky, maybe you can leave here alive. Lieutenant Lev spoke as he prepared to get up and leave the trench, but he didn't want to be pulled back by the quick-eyed and agile Wei Ran. I'll go with you, Wei Ran said before the other person opened his mouth. If what is said in that cowhide notebook is true and I want to return to my original world, one of the important tasks is to help Lieutenant Lev complete the task. In other words, whether he is willing to follow Lieutenant Lev to his death or not, as long as he wants to go back, he has no choice. Lieutenant Lev carefully glanced at Wei Ran, remained silent for a moment, then pointed to the corpses visible everywhere in the trench and said, give you 1 minute, pick up some useful weapons, and we'll set off in 1 minute. Okay. Wei Ran quickly let go of his hand, enduring the stench of corpses with his nose piercing. He gritted his teeth and found 5 or 6 magazines filled with bullets and 2 long-handled hand grenades pinned to his belt from several German corpses. Your camera is too troublesome, Lieutenant Lev couldn't help but remind. I'm a journalist, Wei Ran said as he stuffed his camera into his arms. He didn't forget that another task indicated on the leather notebook was to take 6 photos. Once we're ready, let's go. Lieutenant Lev no longer persisted and cautiously observed the surroundings before climbing out of the trench and charging towards the ruins of a building on the other side of the street. Following closely behind, Wei Ran quickened his pace while recalling the history he had learned in his professional class. However, although history recorded every crucial moment and event, it was impossible to record every detail on the battlefield. Otherwise, he and Professor Alexei would not have gone to great lengths to find the clue to that T.34 tank. Entering the ruins of this building without any danger, Lieutenant Lev made a silent gesture and cautiously continued along the cracks between the walls. Wei Ran, who was walking behind, nervously looked left and right, afraid that a group of German soldiers would burst out from any corner. As the two of them advanced, amidst the constant gunfire, the sound of gunfire in front became increasingly clear. Lieutenant Lev, who was walking ahead, stopped and turned to press his palm towards Wei Ran. The latter immediately understood the other person's meaning and quickly lowered his body, while the cat crouched and quickly followed. With the help of the surrounding debris and broken arms, the two cautiously continued forward. As the distance gradually narrowed, they finally saw clearly that at the edge of the ruins, in a shell pit with a diameter of 5 or 6 meters, 6 or 7 German soldiers were frantically shooting towards a building in front of them. At the center of the crater, there were 2 unlucky guys with guns in their chests and a soldier shouting something at the radio station. Seeing that Lev had already pulled out his grenade, Wei Ran quickly grabbed the opponent's wrist and shook his head, then pointed to the direction of the gun crater, and imitated the posture of the German soldier holding a radio station to draw. Lieutenant Lev seemed to understand his meaning, nodded, inserted the grenade back into his waist, picked up the Poposha submachine gun again, and pulled the trigger. Da-da-da. In the crisp sound of gunfire, the German soldier who was operating the radio station was the first to be shot in the chest. Lieutenant Lev, who paused for a moment, saw that Wei Ran had not fired, so he immediately raised his gun slightly and hit the back of the remaining enemies before they turned around. Although the gun in your hand is made in Germany, it can still kill Germans, Lieutenant Lev muttered, half joking and half reminding, before jumping into the bullet pit covered in corpses. Wei Ran opened his mouth. Although he often followed Professor Alexei to hunt, at most he only hunted wild boars and ducks, but he never aimed his gun at anyone. But now is not the time for psychological construction. After regaining consciousness, he quickly crawled forward and crawled into the crater. Can you understand German? Lieutenant Lev pulled apart the bodies lying on the radio station, searching for their supplies, and asked Wei Ran. I don't understand, do you understand? Wei Ran squatted next to the radio station and asked. He had seen it before. It was a Feld equipped by Germany for infantry use in 1941, although the communication distance of the Fu. A radio station was less than 2 kilometers. It was already a high-tech product at that time, and it was not even until 1944 that it began to be deployed to the infantry platoon. And the reason why he is so familiar is all because Professor Alexei's studio has a similar model that he didn't know where to find. But it's just that I've seen it before and it's not very useful. Even Professor Alexei is not very proficient in using it, let alone him. I haven't learned German, Lieutenant Lev said as he aimed his gun at the radio station, ready to pull the trigger. Wait a minute. Wei Ran quickly stopped the other person. Keep this radio station for now, maybe it can be used. Lieutenant Lev frowned and asked, do you know how to use it? I know how to use it, I'm a journalist, Wei Ran gritted his teeth and said. He understood. Whenever he said no, this seemingly elderly person would definitely pull the trigger. But history majors like Wei Ran know that the power of communication or intelligence is much greater than that of a gun in their hand. As long as they can find someone who understands German, they may get more useful information from this radio station. You carry it on your own. Lieutenant Lev took off a telescope from the neck of one corpse, tried to see if it was still usable, and immediately hung it around his own neck. Then, he took out a notebook from the arms of another corpse and frowned, stuffing it into his arms. I'll carry it, I'll carry it. Wei Ran glanced at the bloody corpse at the corner of his mouth, endured nausea, took off his earphones and transmitter, groped to put them on, and then picked up the radio and carried it on his shoulder. However, almost as he carried the radio on his back, he regretted it. This big iron lump looks the size of a large shoe box, but its weight is not low, at least about 40 pounds. There is such a thing pressing on the shoulder, let alone a snake bone antenna that is at least 1 meter above the top of the head swaying wildly. In this chaotic battlefield, the danger is imaginable. Lieutenant Lev couldn't bear to watch Wei Ran die. He reached out to help roll down the antenna and hung it in a circle around Wei Ran's neck. If it's not too heavy, just carry it on your back. Maybe I can help you block a bullet, he said. Wei Ran was too lazy to talk nonsense to the other party and directly changed the topic, saying, which direction are we going to go next? Lieutenant Lev, however, did not rush to answer. Instead, he climbed to the edge of the shell pit, took off his boat hat, and shook it vigorously in front of him. Soon after, a faint reflection flashed through a 3-story building that was only 100 meters away. Let's go find that sniper, and we need to hurry up. Lieutenant Lev put on his boat hat again and climbed out of the crater. Upon seeing the situation, Wei Ran, carrying a radio on his back, quickly followed suit. The two of them ran through the ruins of another building with only foundations left and the streets filled with trenches, under the cover of broken arms and scrapped tanks. They dodged and entered the building where the sniper was located. Almost as soon as the two of them had climbed up the second floor, a half-aged boy who looked at most 15 or 16 years old walked out from a nearby room with a gun in his hand. Lieutenant Lev lowered the muzzle slightly and said, "Did you just snipe at those Germans?" The middle-aged boy put away his gun and said, "It's me." "How did you touch behind them?" "The area was occupied by the Germans a week ago." "My tank is over there," Lev explained briefly, then reached out his hand and said, "I am Lieutenant Lev from the 644 Independent Tank Battalion, and this is Victor from the Truth." "Oleg, I'm Oleg." The half-grown boy reached out and shook hands with the two of them, then signaled the way out to follow them into the room. "Welcome to my house. Is this your home?" Wei Ran looked around and said that everyone here was praising everything. The wall facing the shell pit was less than a meter left, and the other 3 walls were covered with scattered bullet marks. As for the ceiling above, there was no sign of it, and one could see planes flying over with thick smoke and smoke puffs blown up by anti-aircraft guns without any obstacles. Even the floor was covered in broken bricks, and even a complete floor could not be found. Only a wooden bed made of bricks barely persisted in its job. And in the middle of this small bed and the doorway, there is also a bonfire heating up a can box that I don't know where to get it from, but the paste cooked in that can box can't even distinguish what it is. "Sooner or later, I will restore this place to its former state," Oleg said with great certainty. "How long have you been here?" Lieutenant Lev asked while observing the surrounding environment. "From the beginning of the war until now," Oleg said with a slightly smug tone as he sat on a brick by the campfire, "I have killed almost 20 Germans. Get out of here as soon as possible, there will soon be Germans coming to find you." Lieutenant Lev's words made Wei Ran and Oleg's faces filled with astonishment. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Sniper. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Sniper. Lieutenant Lev took out a notebook stained with blood from his pocket and said, "I just found it on the German soldiers you sniped. Those people should be German artillery observers. Maybe this place has already been included in the German artillery strike range. And even if they didn't use artillery to demolish this building, they would definitely send someone to search. After all, as you said, this place has been completely occupied by the Germans. I just saw them passing by and randomly killed 2 of them." Oleg looked around in confusion at the words, then struggled to get up and pulled out a well-preserved small photo frame from under the bed, stuffing it into his arms. "Let's go. If time permits, I can take a photo for you." Wei Ran raised the camera hanging around his neck and said that unlike the wireless radio on his back, he knew how to use the outdated Lulai DSLR. This was his main way of earning extra money when he worked as a part-time tour guide for his aunt's travel agency. Most domestic tourist groups would not refuse to spend 100 yuan to change into Soviet military uniforms and take a black and white film photo. Seeing Oleg looking at him, Lieutenant Lev urged, "You better hurry up. Put yourself in a good position quickly." While urging, Wei Ran adjusted the old DSLR in his hand. This camera is much better in quality than the one he bought at a high price when he first started, and the difference is not too big, so there is naturally no difficulty in operating it. "Come on, I'm ready." Oleg sat on the small bed, holding a photo frame that had been taken out of his pocket again, and carrying the Mosingan sniper rifle with an optical scope on his shoulder. Glancing at a family of 3 in the photo, Wei Ran swiftly opened the viewfinder at the top of the camera's canopy, retreated to the entrance, and hastily took a photo of the ruined home. Lieutenant Lev, who had already retreated into the hallway, had already walked down the stairs with his gun almost as soon as the shutter sound rang. Upon seeing this, Wei Ran and Oleg in the room quickly followed suit, and a group of 3 quickly advanced along the collapsed corridors on the first floor, fearing that shells might fall from above at some point. "Victor, where are you going?" Oleg walked with a sniper rifle and asked in a low voice. While speaking, he also handed the can box he had brought out of the room to the direction of the fire guard. "Do you want 2 bites? The mouse I only caught this morning is a very fat one." "Thank you, no need." Wei Ran quickly waved his hand to refuse, then pointed to Lieutenant Lev who was walking at the front. Let's go eliminate the German artillery position with him. Let me go with you all. If the Germans really blow up my house, it wouldn't be a loss for me to go and blow up their cannons, said Oleg, who wolfed down the food. Even if you don't. Before Wei Ran could finish speaking, Lieutenant Lev, who was walking ahead, said directly, follow along, we happen to be short of manpower. He still won. Lieutenant Lev still didn't give Wei Ran a chance to finish speaking, and said in a flat tone, Stalingrad only has two types of people, the living and the dead. The three people moving rapidly in the ruins fell into an indescribable silence. As they passed through a pile of rubble and bricks, the roar of engines and the explosion of grenades came from behind. Looking out through the cracks in the wall, Lieutenant Lev sighed and picked up his gun again to continue moving forward. Wait a moment, Oleg, who was walking in the middle, abruptly called out to Lieutenant Leviticus, are you going to the opposite building? Where are Germans? Lieutenant Lev stopped and asked. There are snipers in that building, very skilled snipers, said Oleg with a chiseled expression. How do you know? Oleg patted the rifle in his hand and said, my father was killed by a sniper in that building. He shot very accurately, even more accurately than my father. Lieutenant Lev hesitated for a moment, then walked to the end of the hallway, took off his boat hat and slowly extended the window sill from the muzzle of his submachine gun. Bang! After a moment, the boat cap that was stuck on the muzzle was accurately hit by a bullet from an unknown location. Before the boat cap could land, Lieutenant Lev quickly poked his head and took a quick look. He then tightened his grip and followed closely. The second bullet hit the edge of the windowsill, splattering a ball of bricks. How is the situation? Wei Ran leaned up against the wall and asked. Lieutenant Lev shook his head and said, there is at least 60 or 70 meters of open space between the two buildings. It's difficult for the sniper to run through alive without solving it. But at such a close distance, we're just living targets. I can cover for you, Oleg pointed at his fingertips. I'll go to the second floor to contain him, you run over and deal with him, and then I'll go over. Are you confident? Before Oleg could answer the question from Wei Ran, Lieutenant Lev simply said, go up, get ready and throw something down. Oleg's face immediately showed a happy smile and he ran up the crumbling stairs. When Oleg's figure completely disappeared from the stairwell, Lieutenant Lev said solemnly to Wei Ran, Victor, you wait here. If I fail, you wait until night to find a way to get there. The artillery position is right ahead at the corner of the street, at most only 1 or 2 kilometers away. If he didn't kill me, don't come to save me in any situation, just throw a grenade at me. Before Wei Ran could say anything, half a brick was thrown down from upstairs, followed by a crisp gunshot from across the street. Almost as soon as the gunshot reached his ears, Lieutenant Lev took a step out of the windowsill, bent over, and rushed towards the wreckage of the tank with only a chassis left in between the two buildings. However, when he leaned his back against the tank tracks, he realized that Wei Ran had also followed him. How did you come here? There must always be someone to cover you up. Wei Ran couldn't explain to Lieutenant Lev, so he picked up a piece of helmet fragment from his feet and stuffed it into his chest. He searched left and right, then picked up another piece and handed it to Lieutenant Leviticus. I've never seen you so afraid of death, Lieutenant Lev muttered, calmly taking the palm-sized piece of steel helmet and stuffing it into the inner pocket of his clothes. Do you think I want to die with you? Wei Ran inwardly slandered, enduring nausea and pulling over the body of a German soldier, struggling to lean it against the edge of the tank wreckage. Lieutenant, trick him into shooting at us, and then how about we alternate using submachine guns to suppress that sniper? Lieutenant Lev stabilized the body and nodded towards Wei Ran, who saw the situation. The latter raised his submachine gun above his head and randomly pulled the trigger in the approximate direction of the building, shouting, probe. Upon hearing this, Lev immediately pushed the body out of his hand, revealing most of his helmet-wearing head. Bang! The crisp sound of gunfire echoed, and the body was overturned by bullets. Lieutenant Lev immediately jumped out from behind the wreckage of the tank and, almost simultaneously with Oleg from the rear, aimed the trigger at a window on the third floor of the building ruins. Victor. Change the magazine quickly. Third floor room. Immediately. Wei Ran, who happened to empty his magazine, hurriedly pulled out a magazine from his belt and replaced it. After Lieutenant Lev finished playing a drum, he quickly pulled the trigger and continued to suppress it. At the same time, Oleg, who was behind them, also aimed at other rooms and fired shots from time to time, suppressing the German sniper hiding in the building to the point where he dared not stand up. Under the alternating cover of the three of them, Wei Ran and Lieutenant Lev ran downstairs at the fastest speed. Even if the sniper upstairs noticed them, they could only drop a grenade at most. Otherwise, if he dared to lean out and shoot directly below, it would be like setting a live target for Oleg. Bang! Without the suppression of the two of them, clear gunshots could be heard again from a room on the third floor. Below, Wei Ran and Lieutenant Lev immediately looked at Oleg's hiding place, but what made them worried was that Oleg had not counterattacked since the gunshot. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. The first kill of Wei Ran. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. The first kill of Wei Ran. Suppressing their worries, the two of them ran into the ruins at the fastest speed and found the staircase leading to the second floor at the other end of the corridor. But Lieutenant Lev was not in a hurry to go up. Instead, he aimed his gun at the wooden door of a room at the edge of the stairs and gave a glance to Wei Ran. With a soft creak, Wei Ran used the muzzle of his submachine gun to push open a wooden door next to the hallway. Then he saw a skinny little girl in her teens, holding a light blue blanket and hiding in the corner of the wall, staring at the two people outside with trembling eyes. Meanwhile, outside the corridor window, the sound of the motorcycle engine was getting closer and closer. The two of them glanced at each other and entered the house in no particular order, sticking to the cracks on the wall and looking outside. To the adrenaline rush of Wei Ran, only a wall away from them, two German half-track motorcycles had already parked in the open space. What's even worse is that due to the obstruction of the building itself, even if Oleg didn't have an accident, he couldn't hit them at all. Just before Wei Ran had figured out what to do, Lieutenant Lev had already ignited a long-handled grenade, opened the door, and threw it out through the hallway window. After a loud explosion, the three German soldiers who had just gotten off their half-track motorcycles were completely silent, but soon, the shouting of the Germans came from another building not far away. "Victor, I'll stop them." Lieutenant Lev spoke as he had already replaced the magazine of the submachine gun. "Block your butt. Run quickly." Wei Ran was about to run upstairs, but within a few steps, he stepped back and picked up the little girl still huddled in the room, whispering, "Let's go upstairs." "Don't forget there's a sniper on top," Lieutenant Lev reminded and followed up the stairs, which could break at any moment. Almost as Wei Ran followed him up to the second floor, Lieutenant Lev's second-hand grenade behind him also jingled and rolled down the stairs. Without complaining about the reckless lieutenant, Wei Ran hugged the skinny little girl and hid in a small room next to the staircase, then covered her whole body with the light blue blanket. Almost as he finished his work, the booming explosion rang out again. However, as Wei Ran was about to come out of the room to help, he heard a particularly clear gunshot, followed by Lieutenant Lev's screams. "It's broken." Wei Ran instinctively wanted to open the wooden door that had just been casually closed, but then lifted his hand as if stung by the door handle. Just through a wooden door, Lieutenant Lev's screams continued, and faintly, he could still hear the sound of leather shoes hitting the ground and the friction between Lieutenant Lev and the floor as he struggled to crawl. "How could I be so unlucky?" Wei Ran anxiously extended his hand again, but ultimately did not have the courage to open the wooden door. The stench of corpses was everywhere around him, Lieutenant Lev's screams outside the door, as well as the calm and steady sound of leather shoes and ground tapping. Even soon after, the German conversation that he could not understand was like a heavy hammer hitting his heart, which had grown up in a peaceful era. Inexplicably, he only felt waves of nausea and vomiting, but he knew better that at this moment, any sound he made would bring fatal consequences. Finally, the brief German conversation outside the door faded away, and a calm male voice with a strong accent slowly asked in Russian, "Where is your companion? We can't wait anymore." Wei Ran took out the long-handled grenade inserted in his waist, mustered up the courage, and fiercely opened the wooden door to throw the grenade out. The sudden movement had already been anticipated by the enemy outside the door, but the flying grenade still startled him and he instinctively wanted to hide in the direction of the stairwell. Almost at the back and forth, Wei Ran took an arrow step and pulled the trigger towards the fallen figure. A crisp and brief gunshot rang out, and the fallen figure's body trembled, but then realized that the bullets seemed to have not hit him. Wei Ran pulled the trigger and realized that there were only a few bullets in the magazine just now. Fortunately, he reacted quickly enough, grabbed the stock with both hands, and swung his submachine gun to hit the arm of the German sniper who had just lifted his pistol. In the crisp sound of gunfire, a blood-stained PPK pistol slipped from the German soldier's hand, while Wei Ran had already released the stock of the gun, took out the posture of a blood fight with Mao Zi in college, grabbed half a brick and fiercely slapped the opponent's face. This heavy blow directly flipped the German soldier who was about to stand up onto the stairs covered in bullet shells. "Victor!" Lieutenant Lev shouted as he threw over a Mauser bayonet with its scabbard attached. Hurriedly taking the bayonet, Wei Ran fiercely pulled out the scabbard and plunged it into the sniper's stomach. The foul and warm blood flowed down the wound onto Wei Ran's hand, wetting the cuffs before splashing onto his face. But Wei Ran, who had lost his sanity, did not stop at all, mechanically repeating the action of pulling out the bayonet and then stabbing in again and again. "Victor, Victor!" Lieutenant Lev struggled to get up at some point, hugging Wei Ran's shoulder while imprisoning his hands. He's dead," he said, "dead." Wei Ran looked at the corpse he was riding under, then at the dark red blood gushing out of his mouth and the lifeless eyes. He couldn't control Yuma's vomiting anymore and let out a "wow" sound on the face of the corpse. "You're eating so well, you even have vegetables." Lieutenant Lev didn't mind being dirty either. He reached out and pulled open the vomit from the combustion chamber. He took out an oval soldier card from the neck of the corpse and casually wiped it, handing it to the former. Then he picked up the PPK pistol and asked without lifting his head, "First time killing?" Wei Ran, who was trying to control his retching, glanced at the soldier card in his hand and crawled away from the corpse with his feet and hands. "Habit is good, but you can kill a sniper the first time and still be a captain. Your luck is really good. If you can live until the end of the war, you can at least get the same rank. Of course, as long as you live in Stalingrad for 3 days, you can at least become a company commander." Lieutenant Lev, who chattered incessantly, also returned the hand grenade he had picked up to Wei Ran. "But remember to pull the line before releasing the grenade next time," he said. "If you pull the line, you'll die." Wei Ran took the grenade and put it back on his belt. "And you? Where were you shot just now?" "Thanks to the one you gave me before." Lieutenant Lev grinned and took out a piece of steel helmet from his pocket. The sharp edge of the piece was stained with a hint of blood. "Your luck is also good." Wei Ran let out a sigh, and his mood gradually calmed down. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Waltz of Flowers. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Waltz of Flowers. Lieutenant Lev played with the PPK pistol he had just picked up and then reluctantly handed it to Wei Ran. "Your loot, this is not something that ordinary German soldiers can use." Taking the pistol and looking at it, Wei Ran changed his hand and handed it to Lieutenant Leviticus. "You take it, I don't need this thing," he said, "then I won't be polite." Lieutenant Lev happily untied the cowhide holster from the waist of the corpse and hung it on his own waist. He then inserted the pistol and covered it with tattered clothes before continuing to search for anything that might be useful on the body. "It's cookies again. Comrade Lenin's blessing. Surprisingly, there's still wine." Lieutenant Lev was pleasantly surprised and took out a silver wine jug from the embrace of the corpse. Unfortunately, when he unscrewed the lid and poured it into his mouth, it was only a small sip. "Sorry, I accidentally drank it all," Lieutenant Lev said awkwardly. "It's okay, let's go see that little girl," Wei Ran said with a wry smile and waved his hand. "She won't live long." Lieutenant Lev dropped the wine jug in his hand, smashed the sniper's rifle optical scope with the stock of his gun, and then removed the firing pin and put it in his pocket. "It's probably not long before the Germans catch up, and we can't possibly complete the mission with her," he said. "At least let her have a full meal." Wei Ran stood up unsteadily and dragged his slightly trembling body towards the small room leaning against the staircase. From beginning to end, the skinny little girl didn't make a sound, just obediently hid in the corner, wrapped in a blanket and trembling. Wei Ran took the biscuit handed by Lieutenant Lev and handed it to her hand. The little girl immediately stretched out her thin and dirty hands, covered the biscuit in her mouth, and began to wolf it down. "Take a sip of water." Wei Ran untied the kettle from his waist and only then discovered that a bullet had been inserted on it at some point, and the water inside had already leaked out. "Drink mine." Lieutenant Lev, who followed in, untied his kettle and threw it over. "I'll go see Oleg." Taking advantage of Lieutenant Lev's absence, Wei Ran took out half of the biscuit box he had recently seized and stuffed it directly into the hand of the little girl who was almost choked by water. He whispered, "What's your name?" The girl put down the kettle, pointed her dirty fingers at her throat and ears, and then waved her little hand. Wei Ran sighed inwardly, gesturing to keep the kettle and not return it to him. He stood up and prepared to walk out. But then, he felt his legs being hugged and lowered his head. The bony little girl was holding half a biscuit in her mouth, looking up at him with her head up. "Do you want to go with me?" Wei Ran thought he had guessed the answer. Unexpectedly, the little girl simply shook her head and raised her finger to the grenade in Wei Ran's waist. "What are you doing with this?" Wei Ran asked in surprise. The little girl looked at Wei Ran quietly, her big eyes no longer filled with the trembling she had just experienced, but instead showed a rare calmness and anticipation amidst the rumbling sound of gunfire. Wei Ran sighed and struggled for a long time before silently pulling out the only 2 hand grenades from his waist and handing them to the little girl. Looking at the big smile on the other person's dirty little face, Wei Ran seemed to be scalded and left this small room in a bit of panic. Behind him, the little girl calmly drew a cross on her chest, then hid the grenade in a light blue blanket and continued to stuff dry biscuits into her mouth. After waiting in the hallway for less than 5 minutes, Oleg ran over from the opposite side with his sniper rifle on his shoulder. "You're not injured?" Wei Ran asked with relief. Taking the biscuit handed by Wei Ran and stuffing it into his mouth, Oleg shook his head vaguely and said, "He didn't hit me, but the ruins where we just hid have been searched by Germans. I didn't dare to shoot to avoid them, but they should catch up soon. Since that's the case, let's go quickly." Lieutenant Lev threw the remaining few cookies into his mouth and walked along the dilapidated corridor to the farthest end from the little girl. "How far are we?" Wei Ran asked as he looked in the direction behind him. Lieutenant Lev pointed to another building almost adjacent to the window and said, "After we pass through at most 3 of these buildings, we may be able to see that firepower point, but there must be many Germans around." Before he could finish speaking, he had already stepped on the windowsill and jumped over the less than 1 meter wide gap between the 2 buildings. After he stood firm, he immediately aimed his submachine gun at the direction of the hallway to help Wei Ran and Oleg provide cover. "Don't be in any danger anymore." After Oleg jumped over, Wei Ran looked under the window and saw no Germans passing by. He immediately stepped on the windowsill and jumped to the opposite side. Compared to the building just now, only 1/3 of the building still maintains its complete outline, while the rest is like being cut open from the middle, completely collapsing outward to form a large area of ruins. Even more eerie was that when they reached the edge of the other end of the hallway, the sound of playing the piano could be heard from a nearby room. The 3 of them looked at each other, and after receiving Lieutenant Lev's nod, Oleg gently used his rifle to push open the open wooden door. "This is a small room with a maximum of 30 square meters. In the center of the room, there is an exceptionally clean piano that has been wiped clean. An elderly man in his 50s is wearing a slightly worn-out black tailcoat and sitting on a chair with a limp leg, playing an unknown song seriously. On a small sofa against the wall, there is an old woman with silver hair all over her face, looking happy at the performer. These two people did not react at all to the three young people who suddenly appeared outside the door. Even until a piece of music was played and the performer with their back to the door said in a calm and gentle tone, "If you want to come in and listen to me play the piano, it's best to knock on the door first. This is the minimum etiquette." Lieutenant Lev, standing among the three, remained silent for a moment. He lifted his blood-stained hand and gently knocked on the wooden door. "Please come in," the old man sitting in front of the piano said ceremoniously, then stood up and carefully leaned the chair with one leg missing against the piano. "What would you like to drink?" The old lady sitting on the sofa also stood up. "Sorry, we only have hot water." "The hot water is good," Wei Ran quickly said, while looking at this not too big small room. It's hard to imagine finding such a cozy room in such a brutal battlefield. Although the only window had been completely blocked with bricks, there were 2 pots of fresh flowers blooming red on the small table against the window, and even the not too large double bed was neatly arranged. "Just find a place to sit, this place is so big." The pianist slowly covered the door and sat back on the lame chair. "What kind of music do you want to listen to?" Wei Ran and the three of them looked at their dirty clothes and walked to the table by the window, feeling a bit awkward. However, for a moment, no one knew how to respond to the old man's question. "Let's do the Waltz of Flowers, I hope the music can make you forget about the damn war outside the door." The old man muttered to himself, determined the tune, leveled the small chair with half a brick, and then picked up a towel to carefully wipe off the dust on his hands before starting his performance. At the same time, the old lady who walked out of the narrow kitchen also brought them each a cup of warm water, and also placed 3 boiled potatoes the size of a ping-pong ball on the table. Before the three of them could express their gratitude, the old lady casually waved her hand and sat back on the small sofa, looking happily at the old man playing. The 3 people sitting at the table tacitly avoided touching the 3 potatoes, not even drinking the water in their cups. With this war going on to this point, both food and clean water are becoming increasingly precious. The flowing and cheerful piano music echoed in this relatively small room. Wei Ran stood up silently and walked to the door. He raised the blood-stained dual-reflex camera on his chest, trying his best to wrap everyone in the room into the square viewfinder, and then gently pressed the shutter. Boom! A sudden yet particularly clear explosion came in as Wei Ran released the shutter. Before he could put down his camera, Wei Ran was stunned for a moment, then frantically opened the door and ran out of the room, looking in the direction they had arrived. Even through the windows of 2 buildings, he could still clearly see the vast expanse of smoke and dust rising from the location where the sniper was killed. He could also see the light blue blanket, which had been blown to pieces, fluttering like petals on the floor covered with corpses. Pu Tong, Wei Ran sat weakly against the wall on the floor. He was not a Virgin Mary, nor did he care about how many people had died or who had won the war that had long been predetermined in history books. For him in the 21st century, those are just a series of numbers and letters that must be memorized for professional exams. However, even so, the shock brought by such a close-up view of the brutality of war still pierced his eyes and couldn't help but shed tears. Unable to distinguish how long had passed, the lively piano music in the room behind him had already stopped. Lieutenant Lev and Oleg walked out and saw Wei Ran leaning against the wall in a daze. "We should go now," Lieutenant Lev patted Wei Ran's shoulder with extra force as he finished speaking, murmuring to himself, "For that little girl." Wei Ran slammed the floor under the hammer hard, stood up silently, followed the 2 of them in silence, and walked down the stairs to the 1st floor. Glancing at the ruins formed by the collapse of the building outside, and then at the silent Wei Ran, Lieutenant Lev impatiently took out half a pack of cigarettes obtained from touching the corpse from his pocket, and each of Oleg and Oleg took out a cigarette and said, "Victor, you are a journalist. You should take a photo of that little girl. This is the only thing you haven't done that requires self-blame, and everything else has nothing to do with you. Don't waste your time, and don't let that little girl's efforts go to waste." Lieutenant Lev said again, "If you're still a qualified taxi and journalist, just take your camera and submachine gun carefully and don't let me waste time guiding you." Wei Ran looked up at Lieutenant Lev, then at Oleg who deliberately hid in the distance, and finally nodded solemnly, "Let's go." End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Basement guarded by firefighters. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Basement guarded by firefighters. The afternoon sun was obscured by the smoke rising from Stalingrad, and even the sky darkened a bit. In the ruins of a collapsed building, the three members of Wei Ran hid in the cracks of the collapsed ruins, secretly observing the German tank and the infantry following behind it from a few meters away through a hole only the size of a palm. "Let's go," Lieutenant Lev finished speaking in a low voice, carefully lifting the blanket over his head and crawling cautiously along the collapsed ruins towards another building in the distance. As the distance gradually drew closer, Wei Ran's heart also jumped to his throat, because the two tanks that had just driven past them were parked not far away, firing in a certain direction in the city area, and behind each tank were a group of German infantry who occasionally raised their guns and fired. Boom! A shell almost grazed the edge of one of the tank's turrets and hit hard near the crevice where they had previously hidden. The collapsed debris stirred up a large amount of smoke and dust, startling the German soldiers and the three others following behind the tank. Lieutenant Lev, who was at the forefront, breathed a sigh of relief, accelerated his pace, and led the two behind him for several tens of meters before rolling into a trench filled with corpses of Soviet soldiers. "Stop aiming, hurry up and leave." Wei Ran reached out and pressed down the rifle that Oleg was about to lift, urging in a low voice. "This kid is really trying to kill himself." They are less than 100 meters away from the German soldiers with their backs to them in a straight line, and no one can run away with a single shot. The three of them walked along the trench, bending over and moving forward quickly. Occasionally, a tank came over and immediately lay dead in the pile of corpses. The roaring tank ran over their heads, and the falling soil clattered down their faces and heads. But they didn't dare to move at all, because the German soldiers following closely behind the tank also jumped over the trenches one after another and rushed to the front line. After waiting for more than 10 minutes until there was no further movement above his head, Lieutenant Lev cautiously stood up and took a glance, then beckoned the two of them to continue moving forward. Under the cover of this trench, the three finally managed to sneak into a 3-story building with bullet holes on its walls without any danger. However, just as Lieutenant Lev, who was leading the way, passed through the damaged wall, a submachine gun hit his head from the side. Lieutenant Lev's body stiffened and he slowly raised his hands. Before Wei Ran and Oleg could raise their guns behind him, they were immediately pointed at by another person wrapped in a cloak. "Come in," one of them whispered. Lieutenant Lev glanced at the firefighter uniform on the opponent's body, finally released his submachine gun, took a few steps forward, and made way for the two people behind him. "Uncle Gulch. Are you still alive?" Oleg suddenly exclaimed in surprise. "Oleg. Are you alive too?" The middle-aged man who had originally pointed a gun at Lieutenant Lev responded with surprise, "Where's your father?" "I died over a month ago." Oleg suddenly met his acquaintance, his tone already tinged with tears. "He was just a child of 15 or 16 years old." "Put your hands down, please." The middle-aged man, referred to as Gorsh by Oleg, hugged Oleg in his arms and calmly spoke to Lieutenant Lev and Wei Ran. Wei Ran's tense nerves finally relaxed along with his drooping hands, but the scene fell into a eerie silence. "Gorsh, let's go back first," said another person hoarsely. Gorsh nodded, but he never let go of Oleg's hand from beginning to end. He just walked forward and said, "Come with me, this building is temporarily safe." Under the leadership of Gorge, the group of 5 walked all the way to the stairwell before stopping. Wei Ran looked up and saw that the staircase leading upstairs had completely collapsed, leaving only a finger-thick rope quietly hanging in mid-air. Before his hand could touch the rope, he was stopped by the horseman who said, "Don't touch that rope, there's a grenade tied to the other end." Upon hearing the words, Wei Ran tightened his grip and turned back, while a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. But that Gorge lifted a dusty door panel on the floor, revealing a circular manhole cover. The man with a hoarse voice lightly tapped on the manhole cover with the muzzle of his gun. Soon, the cover was pushed upwards from inside, revealing the dark rim of the well. "Quickly enter," Gorge said before he could finish his sentence. Oleg was already the first to follow the ladder at the edge of the wellhead. Lieutenant Lev hesitated for a moment, then followed closely and climbed down the ladder. There is no choice but to stay at the end of the combustion engine and keep up honestly. After Gorge crawled in, the manhole cover on top of his head was also covered by the door panel again, leaving only a gap of less than 10 centimeters on either side of the door panel that seemed to have been unintentionally filled with bricks. Under the dark wellhead, with an oil lamp lighting up straight ahead, everyone finally saw the structure here. It's hard to imagine that the space below the wellhead was surprisingly spacious, and what surprised them even more was that there were at least 7 or 8 children under the age of 8 or 9, as well as several wounded people wrapped in bandages, scattered and hiding inside. And between these quiet children and the wounded, there is a young woman constantly busy. This used to be the basement of the fire department, and the beautiful lady was Nurse Yuna. She and the injured were all rescued by us from the trenches outside. Goldie pointed to the horseman who came down with him and said, "He's Valerie, a firefighter who used to work here like me. And the one carrying an oil lamp is Sergey, a nearby electrician. Now let's talk about you guys. How did you bring Oleg here?" "Uncle Gulch, let me tell you." Oleg was quite excited and first introduced Lieutenant Lev and Weiran's identities, then talked about what happened at his own home and the tasks they were about to complete. Upon hearing this, Gorge frowned and gestured for everyone to follow him to the innermost side of the basement. After sitting against the wall, he whispered, "I know the artillery position you're talking about. The Germans have deployed several cannons there and tanks are protecting it, but with just the 3 of you, even if you go there, you can't do anything." Lieutenant Lev frowned at the words and said, "How far is it from here?" "Less than 2 kilometers, Gulch pointed to the top of his finger and said, "Before this building was bombed to 3 floors, when the weather was good, you could even see the position clearly from the top. But since the Germans discovered our artillery observer here, this building has become what it is now." "Lieutenant Comrade, maybe I have a way." A weak voice came from afar, and then a wounded man with a bandage wrapped around his chest sat up with the help of the nurse. "What's the solution?" Lieutenant Lev quickly chased after him. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Assembled Fleet Members. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Assembled Fleet Members. I know there's a tank nearby that can still move. The wounded soldier regained his strength and continued, "If that tank is still in its original position, perhaps you can use that tank to destroy their artillery positions." "Where is that tank?" Lieutenant Lev asked excitedly. "In the paint shop downstairs of the building not far away. Gorge should know that location." The wounded soldier gasped and said, "I am a worker from the Stalingrad tractor factory who drove a tank out to participate in the battle. The tank I just mentioned was driven by my colleague, but later they ran away because they were afraid of death. At that time, I personally killed them with a submachine gun." "I know that paint shop," Gorge frowned and said, "but that building has been bombed to the point where only one wall is left. Even if the tank is still there, it's probably buried. And there's also a problem," the injured worker said. "Even if you can move that tank alone, you can't fire. You need at least 2 experienced helpers to do it." "I need a loader and a driver," Lieutenant Lev said as he looked around. "I can be a loader." Oleg said first, I can move shells. There are so many people here, it's not your turn yet. Gulch reached out and pulled Oleg aside, while lightly hammering Valerie's silent shoulder with his fist. After nodding to each other, Gorge looked at Lieutenant Lev and said, I used to have a tractor. If the difference is not significant, maybe I can move that tank and Valerie can be your loader. Since that's the case, let's start now. Lieutenant Lev finished speaking and prepared to stand up. Wait a minute, we're still one person away. Wei Ran, who had not spoken, grabbed Lieutenant Leviticus. Radio operator. Lieutenant Lev asked in confusion, the tanks produced by the tractor factory don't even have scopes, let alone radios. Moreover, even if they do, there is only one tank nearby that doesn't need radios at all. Now the radio has it, said Wei Ran, taking off the German radio station that had been carried on his shoulder. What's the use of having a radio, said Sergei, the electrician closest to the kerosene lamp. Do you want to use it to greet the mother of nearby Germans? Wei Ran shook his head helplessly, knowing the flaws of the T.34 tank. At this time, the T.34 still used 76mm guns, but the caliber was secondary. The most important thing was this type of T.34, and the narrow interior space could only accommodate 4 people. In other words, the commander responsible for finding targets in the turret also has to work as a part-time loader, which is a fatal problem that directly reduces the efficiency of the T.34 76 tank compared to the T.34/85, which can accommodate 5 people in the later stage. Seeing everyone looking at him, Wei Ran breathed a sigh of relief and said, if we want to destroy that firepower position as quickly as possible, or live as long as possible under the encirclement of surrounding tanks, we also need a radio, and then someone needs to be able to command tank operations with a radio from a good field of view. Fortunately, you're just a journalist. If you were a tank soldier, I would have stuffed you into the tracks to make a pie. Lev didn't even take Wei Ran's proposal seriously and stood up, ready to continue walking outside. My proposal at least gives you a greater chance of completing the task. Wei Ran leaned against the wall without moving at all. There's only one tank, Lieutenant Leviticus. You don't have a chance to make a mistake. Lieutenant Lev stood there for a moment in silence and said, we don't have time to find an identical radio station. The dim basement fell silent again, and after a long time, the old electrician Sergei sighed and said, I have a way. What's the solution? Lieutenant Lev asked subconsciously. The other night, when I was searching for supplies in the trenches outside, I seem to have seen a similar radio station. Sergei spoke with uncertainty, but it's still in its original position, and I don't even know if it can be used. Let's go find it now. Wait a minute. Gorsh stopped Lieutenant Lev, who was reckless. It's at most 2 hours before it gets dark. It's safer to go after dark. Lieutenant Lev nodded reluctantly and sat down next to Wei Ran before saying, Victor, you can command us over the radio then. Me. I'm just a journalist, Wei Ran added silently in his heart, even a journalist's identity is fake. Even without you, I could have completed the task, Lieutenant Lev said somewhat impolitely. Knowing that the other party was comforting him, Wei Ran didn't say anything and could only reluctantly agree. If the war is over and you're still alive, remember to take a look at Mamiev's post for me. Lieutenant Lev whispered, actually, everyone present knows that following Lieutenant Lev to complete that mission is almost impossible to survive, and he himself may have a clearer understanding of the outcome soon after. Wei Ran nodded silently, tightly closing his lips without making any sound. 2 hours flew by, and the sky outside gradually darkened. Even the gunfire that had been going on for a day had weakened significantly. Kara the cast iron manhole cover was gently pushed aside by Gorge, and then he poked his head out and observed the gap under the door panel. After confirming that there was no danger, he gently supported the door panel and allowed everyone to climb out of the basement one by one. You guys wait here, I'll go find the radio station, said the old electrician Sergei, carefully walking towards the trench outside the building against the wall. In the anxious waiting of everyone, time passed by minute by second, and it was not until an hour later that Sergei crawled in along the damaged exterior wall of the building. See if it's this. Sergei placed the item he had brought back at Wei Ran's feet. Lieutenant Lev and Oleg immediately put up 2 cloaks to cover the flame lying on the floor, while firefighter Gorge, who was also hiding under the cloak, lit up the kerosene lighter in his hand. After comparing the nameplates of the 2 radios, Wei Ran nodded heavily, and then recalled Professor Alexei's previous operating steps while groping to complete the startup work of these 2 radios. Compared to the knob on one of the radio stations, and then adjusted the other radio station to the same position, Wei Ran handed one of the earphones to Gorsh, and then gently scraped the other transmitter with his fingernail. Gorsha's face immediately showed a surprised expression, nodding at Wei Ran repeatedly. After he turned off the power, Gorsh quickly blew hard at the small flame on the lighter, and the strong smell of kerosene mixed with a stronger bad breath rushed towards him, causing the dark Wei Ran hang to not spit out the chrysanthemums. Struggling to remove his cloak, firefighter Gulch grabbed Oleg's shoulder and whispered, "Oleg, the safety here is up to you. Unless necessary, try not to shoot, otherwise it will be difficult for the people in the basement to survive. Rather than killing Germans, the more important task is to keep those children younger than you alive until the end of the war. If we don't come back alive, you need to find ways to provide food for those children, medicine for those injured, and bring back more children and injured people. In short, Oleg, before we come back, all the people in the basement have been handed over to you." Oleg nodded forcefully and pointed to the nearby stairwell, saying, "Uncle Gulch, let me go to the rooftop before that. Maybe I can help you." After hesitating for a moment, Gorge sighed and whispered to the old electrician Sergei and Valerie who were waiting on the side, "Send him up." End of this chapter. Chapter 10. The Tragedy of High and Underground. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Chapter 10. The Tragedy of High and Underground. In the pitch-black night, Oleg was carried up to the 2nd floor by the old electrician Sergei and firefighter Valerie. After avoiding the grenade fixed at the other end of the rope from a distance, he immediately climbed up the 3rd floor along the stairs with only a small half left. He mounted his sniper rifle in the corner of the broken wall and aimed it at the destination where Wei Ran and others were about to go. At the location on the 1st floor, Lieutenant Lev and Wei Ran, led by firefighters Gorch and Valerie, as well as veteran electrician Sergei, crawled in the dark towards the ruins left by the collapse of another building in the distance. Under the cover of night, their forward speed was much faster than during the day, but even so, they needed to be extremely careful because according to Gorge, German patrol teams would occasionally pass by nearby even at night. So much so that by the time they arrived at their destination, at least an hour had already passed. "That's almost it," Gorge pointed to a red brick ruin and said, "This should be the location of that paint shop. It used to be a very beautiful 2-story brick building." "Let's get started." Lieutenant Lev didn't finish speaking and bent down to pick up a few bricks that were still stuck together, gently moving them to one side. The others immediately stepped forward to help, quietly cleaning up the remains of the tomb-like building. Amidst the busy handling of the crowd, a towering barrel gradually emerged from the stacked bricks, followed by the front of the tank, and then a small half of the turret. As the east gradually revealed its fish belly white color, and as the rumbling sound of artillery came from several hundred meters away from the German artillery positions and further away towards the Volga River, the concrete pillars pressing on the cockpit canopy were finally pushed aside by everyone with difficulty. "Next, let's see if it can start," Lieutenant Lev said as he lifted the heavy hatch. "I hope we can survive." Firefighter Gorge dug out a can of paint from under the tank chassis and pried it open. He reached in and dipped his hand, leaving a bright red handprint on the turret with force. "Comrade journalist, if we haven't come back alive, if you can survive, I hope you can find this tank after the war is over and let everyone know my name. Of course, it would be even better if you could include us in the Pravda." "This method is good." Old electrician Sergei also climbed onto the tank, dipped his hand in the paint can, and then slapped the turret. "Although I don't have to follow you, I also want to go to the newspaper," he said. "Since that's the case, let's all leave a handprint." While Lieutenant Lev spoke, He also casually patted the painted palm on the turret with firefighter Valerie. On the other hand, at this moment, Wei Ran was already frozen in place, and the 4 bright red palm prints on the turret of this T.34 tank had gradually overlapped with the tank in memory. So it turns out like this. Victor, leave a handprint too, Lieutenant Lev, who had already climbed into the tank turret, suggested as he put the radio headphones on his head. Oh. Okay. Wei Ran regained his senses and reached out to get some paint in the paint can, slamming it hard on the tank's turret. It's almost dawn, we should also set off now, Gorsh. Let's start the tank, Lieutenant Lev said, holding on to the edge of the turret hatch. Wait. Wei Ran casually wiped the paint on his hands on his pants and said, let me take a photo of you all. It won't take much time. This is my first time taking a photo, said veteran electrician Sergei as he quickly climbed up the turret and held onto the barrel, standing straight. Seeing Lieutenant Lev nod, Wei Ran quickly took out his camera, fiddled with it, and took a photo of each person. He also took a group photo of the 4 of them and the tank. I will put you under the clock tower, Lieutenant Lev pointed to the end of the field of vision and said, you should be able to see us there. The command is up to you. Before Lev could finish speaking, the tank started smoothly and, driven by firefighter Gorch, drove almost rudely out of the ruins that covered the latter half of the body. With the creaking sound of the tracks, the T.34 tank with 5 bright red handprints on the side of the turret bypassed the ruins of the building and headed straight towards the German artillery position. Halfway through, Wei Ran and the old electrician Sergei jumped off the tank and ran to the bottom of the clock tower, which was only half left. This is the only high ground where German artillery positions can be seen, but at the same time, it is also within the direct range of German artillery. Even in this clock tower, there are 5 German soldiers stationed. However, with mental calculation but no intention, they were all sent back to their hometown by the old electrician Sergei with a submachine gun as soon as they opened the door. The 2 climbed up the spiral staircase all the way to the highest point. Wei Ran handed over the defense work and grenades to the old electrician, while he himself looked out at the speeding tank from the wall. However, just as he was about to say something to the transmitter, a particularly clear shutter sound came into his ear, and then the intense white light occupied all of his vision. When his gaze returned to normal, Wei Ran stared blankly at the familiar studio and then sat down on the cold floor, letting out a long sigh of relief. With a soft clatter, a cowhide notebook quietly appeared and lay on the floor in front of it, automatically flipping to the position on the second page. On this page, the T.34 that was originally sketched with a metal feather pen has become a black and white photo, and next to this photo, there is even an ordinary long paper bag. And directly below the photo, the metal feather pen left lines of horizontal and vertical Chinese characters in the sound of schwa 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 schwa. The tragedy beneath the Highlands. Lieutenant Lev, firefighter Vasily, and firefighter Gorch were captured by the German army after completing their mission due to a broken tank track. They were shot and killed in the early morning of September 29, 1942. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the 3 of them were posthumously awarded the Defense of Stalingrad Medal and the second-class Patriotic War Medal. Electrician Sergei used radio to command tanks to destroy 2 German tanks, 1 tank destroyer, 7 artillery guns, and killed 9 German soldiers. After all, he detonated a hand grenade and committed suicide. After the Battle of Stalingrad, he was posthumously awarded the first-class Patriotic War Guerrilla Medal. Sniper Oleg killed 14 German soldiers and saved 21 Stalingrad orphans and 8 wounded by the end of the battle. After the Battle of Stalingrad, he was awarded the second-class Patriotic War Guerrilla Medal. On October 20, 1943, he sacrificed himself in the nameless wilderness during the Battle of Kiev. The T.34 tank, at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, was repaired and sent to the battlefield. On March 9, 1943, it was abandoned in the unnamed forest on the banks of the Don River due to gearbox failure. At this point, the metal feather pen started a new line, detailing the medals and certificate numbers each person received. In his waiting, this metal feather pen started another line and continued to write with a swish. When the photographer picked up the gun, perhaps the last justice and kindness were still preserved in his camera. But what is recorded in the film will always be the cruelest moments of war. Just as Wei Ran finished reading the last word, the paper with photos attached and full of words automatically flipped over a page. What made his hair stand on end in horror was that on the back of this pale yellow paper, there was a slowly rotating blood-red vortex. And in the center of this vortex, there is still something floating up and down. And the metal feather pen, which had been suspended all along, continued to write under the blood-red vortex as if there were no one else. Camera or bayonet, there is always a photographer's weapon. The former records the most real war, while the latter creates the most bloody slaughter. With a clang, the metal feather pen, which seemed to have entered the time of the sage, fell heavily on the floor and remained motionless. After hesitating for a moment, Wei Ran took a deep breath and slowly reached out to the blood-red vortex that occupied half of the paper on the page. He slowly drew a slender Mauser bayonet from inside. Interestingly, at the handguard of this bayonet, there is also an exceptionally thick oval-shaped World War II German soldier badge worn. Taking this nearly 40-centimeter-long bayonet, I carefully examined it, and by a stroke of genius, I tried to send it back to the slowly rotating blood-red vortex. The next scene made him widen his eyes again, and surprisingly, the bayonet could really be put back. Carefully standing up this page of paper, Wei Ran scrutinized it back and forth between the front and back. He couldn't figure out how this thin piece of paper inserted such a long bayonet. Even when he tried to close his notebook, he was not affected at all. Are you afraid that there really is Soviet black technology? After regaining his senses, Wei Ran suddenly remembered something and quickly ran to the workbench against the wall, opening the studio surveillance from the desktop computer in the farthest corner. The replayed surveillance footage gave him a slight sigh of relief. It only recorded the scene where he finished calling Professor Alexei, his phone slipped and hit his big toe, and then he sat on the floor. As for the leather notebook, it never appeared in the camera from beginning to end. And most importantly, from the moment he finished the call to checking the surveillance footage, less than a minute had passed, and even most of the time on the screen was spent sitting on the floor in a daze. However, to be cautious, he still deleted the entire day's monitoring records and unplugged the power. Anyway, this thing was only under his own surveillance, and Professor Alexei not only didn't care at all, but also didn't even have a password to access the monitoring. After clearing the last bit of suspicious evidence, Wei Ran picked up the notebook still lying on the floor. After flipping to the second page, he first looked at the blood-red vortex on the back and confirmed it was still there. Then he flipped back to the front and took out several pre-washed negatives from the paper bag next to the black and white T.34 photo. Turn on the switch of the copy board again and put these negatives on. Wei Ran held up a magnifying glass and carefully observed each one. These negatives were taken by himself, including photos of Oleg holding a family portrait and a sniper rifle in his ruined home, photos of the old man sitting on a chair with a limp leg playing the piano, and photos of Lieutenant Lev and others taking solo and group photos after they dug out the tank. And what is recorded in the last film is the scene he saw at the last moment, standing at the highest point of the dilapidated clock tower, preparing to use radio to command the tank to fight. In the lens captured in this film, most of the city has been reduced to ruins, with bodies and ferries floating on the Volga River in the corners, reflecting the sun that has just risen above the horizon with sparkling waves. At the center of the photo, the T.34 tank, resembling the protagonist, rushed forward towards the artillery position in front, and between the artillery and the tank, there were two opposing German tanks. Surrounding them, German soldiers holding guns were frozen in the moment of running, and some artillery rushed towards the several howitzers with their barrels raised high. With a loud bang, Wei Ran turned off the power of the copy board, threw the magnifying glass aside, and leaned against the back of the chair exhausted, closing his eyes. Although less than 10 minutes have passed in the world that belongs to him, in the world that does not belong to him 70 or 80 years ago, that difficult day is longer than a century. End of this chapter.